There exist rare moments in television broadcasting when the carefully orchestrated flow of entertainment programming gives way to authentic human drama that transcends the medium's typical boundaries. On a Wednesday afternoon in November 2024, Family Feud was conducting what appeared to be a standard recording session featuring two families engaged in the competitive format that had sustained the program's popularity across multiple generations of viewers. The studio environment maintained its customary energy, the production crew executed their established protocols, and Steve Harvey prepared to facilitate the proceedings with the combination of humor and interpersonal warmth that had become his professional signature. However, one contestant was carrying knowledge of a family situation so complex and potentially explosive that when she finally summoned the resolve to disclose it during the active recording, her revelation would halt production completely, transform the studio atmosphere from light-hearted competition to serious emotional confrontation, and ultimately force multiple family members to address long, buried secrets in the most public forum imaginable. What transpired during those extraordinary minutes demonstrated that truth, regardless of how long it has been concealed or how painful its revelation might prove, possesses an inherent power that demands acknowledgement and resolution. If you appreciate authentic moments of family reckoning and the courage required to confront difficult realities, please take a moment to support this channel by selecting the like option and subscribing to receive future content. The narrative you are about to experience illustrates why honesty, even when delivered in unexpected circumstances, remains foundational to genuine family relationships and personal integrity. Patricia Morrison was 53 years old and had spent the previous 32 years maintaining what she increasingly recognized as an unsustainable silence regarding events that had occurred during her early adulthood. She resided in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where she had built a respectable career in healthcare administration and had established herself as a competent professional trusted by colleagues and valued by her employer. To external observers, Patricia represented the embodiment of middle-class American success. She owned her home, had raised two accomplished adult children, maintained active involvement in community organizations, and presented herself as someone who had navigated life's challenges with competence and grace. However, beneath that carefully constructed exterior existed a woman who had been carrying a secret of such magnitude that its weight had shaped nearly every decision she had made across 3 decades. Patricia had grown up in a working-class family in rural Minnesota during the 1970s and early 1980s. Her father had worked in manufacturing while her mother had managed their household and supplemented the family income through part-time clerical work. The family had not been prosperous, but they had maintained stability through careful financial management and strong work ethic. Patricia had been an excellent student who understood that education represented her most viable pathway to economic advancement and broader opportunities than those available in her small hometown. She had earned scholarships that made college attendance feasible and had pursued a degree in business administration with focus on healthcare management. During her sophomore year of college, Patricia had entered into a romantic relationship with a fellow student named James Morrison. The relationship had developed quickly, characterized by the intensity and passion that often marks young adult romances conducted away from parental oversight and hometown social constraints. James had been charming and ambitious, qualities that Patricia found attractive as she contemplated her own future and the kind of partner she hoped to build a life alongside. They had discussed marriage in general terms, though no formal engagement had been established during that period. At the end of Patricia's sophomore year, she had discovered that she was pregnant. The discovery had precipitated a crisis that would alter the trajectory of her life in ways she could not have anticipated at age 20. Patricia and James had discussed their options extensively, recognizing that all available choices carried significant implications for their educational plans and future prospects. Abortion remained legally available, though socially controversial in their community. Adoption would allow Patricia to complete her pregnancy while placing the child with a family better positioned to provide parental care. Choosing to parent would require both of them to fundamentally restructure their lives around the demands of raising a child, while still completing their own education and establishing their careers. After considerable deliberation and consultation with limited trusted advisors, Patricia and James had made the decision to proceed with the pregnancy and to marry before the child's birth. The wedding had been conducted quietly during the summer between Patricia's sophomore and junior years, attended only by immediate family members who expressed varying degrees of support for the young couple's choices. Patricia had returned to college in the fall, now as a married student managing pregnancy while attempting to maintain her academic performance. James had likewise continued his education, though the financial pressures associated with supporting a family had required him to reduce his course load and increase his work hours. Their daughter Jessica had been born in February of Patricia's junior year. The arrival of an infant had strained the young marriage in predictable ways. Patricia had struggled to balance the demands of coursework with the realities of new motherhood. James had felt overwhelmed by financial responsibility and the sudden transition from college student to family provider. The relationship that had seemed promising when characterized primarily by romantic attraction proved less resilient when subjected to the stresses of premature adulthood and parental obligation. However, the situation had become significantly more complicated due to circumstances that Patricia and James had agreed to conceal from their families and from Jessica as she grew older. During Patricia's pregnancy, James had maintained a brief affair with another student. The affair had ended before Jessica's birth, but it had fundamentally damaged the trust between Patricia and James. Patricia had discovered the infidelity, but had chosen not to disclose it to her family or to James's family, partly because she felt trapped by circumstances and partly because she feared that revealing the affair might lead to the dissolution of their marriage at a time when she felt financially and socially dependent on maintaining that marriage. Patricia and James had remained married for 5 years following Jessica's birth, presenting a united front to their families while privately navigating a relationship characterized more by obligation than affection. They had a second child, a son named Matthew, when Jessica was 3 years old. The expansion of their family had created additional pressure on an already strained marriage, though both Patricia and James continued to maintain the appearance of a functional partnership to external observers. When Jessica was 5 years old and Matthew was 2, Patricia and James had finally acknowledged that their marriage was unsustainable. They had divorced with relative civility, establishing custody arrangements that allowed both parents to remain actively involved in their children's lives. James had relocated to Chicago for employment opportunities, maintaining regular contact with Jessica and Matthew through scheduled visitation. Patricia had remained in Minnesota, completing her degree and building her career in healthcare administration while managing the responsibilities of primary custody. The divorce itself had not been particularly unusual or scandalous by contemporary standards. However, during the divorce proceedings, information had emerged that fundamentally altered Patricia's understanding of her family situation. Through the discovery process required for determining financial support obligations, Patricia had learned that James had substantial assets that he had concealed during their marriage. More significantly, she had learned that James had received a considerable inheritance from a deceased relative approximately 1 year after their wedding, inheritance that he had never disclosed to Patricia despite the fact that they had been struggling financially during that period. Patricia had been devastated by this discovery, recognizing that James had allowed her to work multiple jobs while managing infant care, had allowed both of them to accumulate student loan debt, and had permitted their families to provide financial assistance that would not have been necessary had he simply been honest about his financial resources. The betrayal had felt comprehensive and had colored Patricia's perception of their entire marriage as having been built on deception from nearly its inception. However, Patricia had made a decision during the divorce proceedings that would haunt her for the subsequent decades. She had agreed to accept a settlement that was far less favorable than what she could have demanded had she pursued aggressive litigation regarding James's concealed assets. Her attorney had advised her that she had strong grounds for claiming a substantial portion of those assets, given that they had been acquired during the marriage and deliberately hidden from her. Patricia had chosen not to pursue that course, partly because she wanted to conclude the divorce proceedings quickly, and partly because she had not wanted to subject her young children to protracted conflict between their parents. More significantly, Patricia had agreed to James's request that they not disclose the full extent of his deception to their families or to their children. James had argued that such disclosure would damage his relationship with Jessica and Matthew and would create unnecessary conflict with extended family members. He had proposed a substantial but unofficial additional financial contribution to the children's support in exchange for Patricia's agreement to maintain his secret. Patricia, exhausted from years of difficult marriage and divorce proceedings, had agreed to this arrangement. The decision to accept this agreement had seemed pragmatic at the time. Patricia had received financial support that improved her ability to provide for Jessica and Matthew. She had avoided protracted legal battles that would have consumed time, money, and emotional energy. She had preserved what appeared to be a functional co-parenting relationship with James that allowed their children to maintain relationships with both parents without being caught in the middle of parental conflict. However, the cost of maintaining this silence had been substantial and had accumulated over the intervening decades. Patricia had been unable to explain to her own parents why her divorce settlement had been modest despite James's evident financial comfort. She had been unable to help Jessica and Matthew understand the full context of their parents' marriage and divorce when they eventually asked questions as they matured. She had been required to witness James portray himself as a devoted father who had always prioritized his children's welfare, when she knew that he had concealed resources that could have significantly improved their childhood circumstances. Most painfully, Patricia had watched as her daughter Jessica had developed a relationship with her father that seemed to be based on an incomplete and distorted understanding of their family history. James had remarried several years after his divorce from Patricia and had built what appeared to be a successful life in Chicago. He maintained regular contact with Jessica and Matthew, provided financial support as agreed, and presented himself as someone who had navigated a difficult early marriage with maturity and responsibility. Jessica, who had no memory of her parents' marriage and had only known them as divorced individuals, had accepted her father's narrative about their family history without question. Patricia had rationalized her silence in various ways over the years. She had told herself that protecting her children from knowledge of their father's deception was a form of parental love. She had convinced herself that the financial arrangement she had accepted was adequate and that pursuing additional resources would have been motivated by vindictiveness rather than justice. She had argued internally that maintaining stable co-parenting relationships was more important than settling old scores or demanding public accountability for private wrongs. However, as Jessica had matured into adulthood and had begun to develop her own serious romantic relationships, Patricia had found her silence increasingly difficult to maintain. When Jessica became engaged to be married, Patricia had watched her daughter plan a wedding and prepare to build a life with her chosen partner. She had listened to Jessica discuss the importance of honesty and communication in marriage. She had observed Jessica's idealistic vision of partnership and commitment. The disconnect between Jessica's understanding of what marriage should entail and the reality of what her parents' marriage had become increasingly painful for Patricia to witness without comment. The situation had reached a crisis point 6 months before the family Feud taping, when Jessica had shared that she and her fiancé were considering asking James to contribute financially to their wedding expenses. Jessica had explained that her father had offered to help and that she appreciated his generosity and his desire to be involved in this significant life event. Patricia had felt physically ill listening to this conversation, knowing that James's apparent generosity was being funded by resources he had concealed from her decades earlier, resources that could have provided significantly better circumstances for Jessica during her childhood. Patricia had been on the verge of revealing the truth to Jessica on multiple occasions during those months. However, she had consistently retreated from full disclosure, fearful of the consequences and uncertain whether revealing decades-old deceptions would ultimately benefit or harm her daughter. The internal conflict had been consuming and had affected Patricia's health and well-being in measurable ways. It was during this period of intense internal struggle that Patricia's sister had suggested the family apply to appear on Family Feud. The suggestion had initially seemed absurd to Patricia given the turmoil she was experiencing regarding family secrets. However, as she considered the possibility further, Patricia had begun to see it as potentially providing a catalyst for truth, telling that she had been unable to initiate through private family conversations. She could not fully articulate why she believed that appearing on a game show might create the circumstances necessary for finally revealing the truth she had concealed for 3 decades. However, she felt increasingly certain that continuing to maintain her silence was unsustainable and that some external force might be necessary to finally break through the inertia that had kept her quiet for so long. The family that agreed to apply consisted of Patricia, Jessica, Matthew, Patricia's sister Carol, and Carol's adult son. James had not been invited to participate, ostensibly because the team required only 5 members, and including him would have created logistical complications. However, Patricia's real motivation for excluding James was that she did not trust herself to maintain composure around him given her current emotional state regarding the secrets they had maintained. When the family was selected to participate in the taping scheduled for November 2024, Patricia had made a private decision that she shared with no one. If an appropriate opportunity presented itself during the recording, if circumstances aligned in ways that felt meaningful, she would reveal the truth about James's deception during their marriage and about her complicity in concealing that deception from their children for 30 years. She could not predict what would happen following such a revelation. She could not control how Jessica and Matthew would respond or whether her relationship with her children would survive her confession. However, she had reached a point where continuing to carry this secret felt more damaging than the risks associated with finally speaking the truth. The Morrison family arrived at the Family Feud studio on the designated Wednesday morning in November. Patricia had slept poorly the night before, her mind racing through various scenarios regarding how the day might unfold and what she might say if she decided to proceed with revealing her long-concealed truth. Jessica appeared excited and relaxed, treating the experience as an enjoyable family activity with no awareness of the internal crisis her mother was experiencing. Matthew seemed somewhat less enthusiastic about the television appearance, but was participating in good spirits to support his family. Carol had been Patricia's primary confidant regarding the situation with James, and she watched her sister with concern, uncertain whether Patricia would actually follow through with her stated intention to reveal the truth during the taping. Their opponents were the Patterson family from Tennessee, an affable group who brought considerable competitive energy to their participation. Steve Harvey conducted his standard opening procedures, and the game began with the customary format and pacing. The first question asked families to name something people lie about. Carol buzzed in for the Morrison family and answered, their age, which appeared on the board as the number 3 response. The family played the question and provided several acceptable answers, winning the first round with relative ease. The second round presented a question about things people regret not doing sooner. Patricia felt her heart rate increase as Steve Harvey read the question, recognizing that the topic resonated uncomfortably with her current state of mind regarding the revelations she was contemplating. Jessica buzzed in and answered, getting married, which was on the board. As the family worked through additional responses, Patricia became increasingly preoccupied with internal debate about whether and how to introduce the subject of her concealed truth into the proceeding. When Patricia's turn arrived to provide an answer, she stood at her position and looked directly at Jessica before responding. Her answer was technically responsive to the question, but carried obvious additional meaning for anyone who understood the subtext of her family situation. She stated that people often regret not telling the truth sooner. The answer was on the board, but Steve Harvey noticed something in Patricia's delivery that suggested significance beyond the surface level of game show participation. The game continued through several additional rounds, with the Morrison family demonstrating adequate performance, though Patricia's increasing distraction was evident to family members, even if it was not yet apparent to the studio audience or to Steve Harvey. During a commercial break, Jessica approached her mother with concern, asking if Patricia was feeling well and whether she needed to stop participating. Patricia assured her daughter that she was managing adequately but internally felt that she was approaching a point of crisis regarding her silence. The Morrison family won the main game and earned the right to participate in the fast money round for the grand prize. However, before that final segment could commence, Patricia made a decision that would fundamentally alter not only the remainder of the taping, but potentially the entire dynamic of her family relationships. She approached Steve Harvey directly while cameras continued to record and stated that she needed to address something before the family could proceed with the competition. Steve Harvey's expression shifted immediately from his customary entertainment persona to genuine concern as he recognized that something serious was occurring. He requested that production pause temporarily and ask Patricia what she needed to discuss. Patricia looked at Jessica and Matthew, both of whom appeared confused and somewhat alarmed by their mother's obvious distress. She took a deep breath and began speaking words that she had rehearsed mentally countless times, but had never actually articulated aloud to her children. Patricia addressed her children directly, speaking clearly despite the visible tremor in her hands and the tears beginning to form in her eyes. She explained that there were aspects of her marriage to their father and the subsequent divorce that they had never been told, and that she had spent 30 years concealing information that they deserved to have known. Jessica immediately attempted to interrupt, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation and uncertain why her mother was choosing this particular venue for family disclosures. However, Patricia requested that Jessica allow her to complete her statement before responding, emphasizing that she had been silent for 3 decades and needed to finally speak without interruption. Patricia proceeded to reveal that James had concealed substantial financial assets throughout their marriage despite allowing both of them to struggle financially and to accumulate debt that would not have been necessary had he been honest about his resources. She explained that he had inherited considerable wealth approximately 1 year into their marriage and had deliberately chosen not to disclose this inheritance to her. She described how she had worked multiple jobs while managing care for infant Jessica, how they had accepted financial assistance from their families despite James having resources that would have made such assistance unnecessary, and how the stress of perceived financial insecurity had contributed to the deterioration of their marriage. Patricia then addressed the more painful aspect of her confession. She acknowledged that she had learned about James's concealed assets during their divorce proceedings but had agreed to accept a settlement that did not reflect her legal entitlement to those marital assets. More significantly, she admitted that she had agreed to James's request that they not disclose his deception to their families or to Jessica and Matthew. She explained that this agreement had been motivated by her exhaustion, her desire to conclude the divorce quickly, and her acceptance of James's argument that such disclosure would damage his relationship with his children. Patricia's voice broke as she addressed Jessica specifically. She acknowledged that her silence had allowed James to present himself as a devoted father who had always prioritized his children's welfare when the historical reality was far more complex and ethically problematic. She recognized that her agreement to maintain his secret had been a form of betrayal to Jessica and Matthew, depriving them of accurate information about their family history and about the circumstances that had shaped their childhood experiences. The studio had fallen completely silent as Patricia spoke. Jessica stood motionless, her expression reflecting a complex mixture of shock, confusion, and dawning comprehension. Matthew appeared stunned and was looking between his mother and sister, as if trying to determine how to respond to information that fundamentally altered his understanding of his family's history. Steve Harvey remained quiet, recognizing that what was unfolding required space, and that any attempt at entertainment or deflection would be inappropriate given the gravity of what was being revealed. When Patricia concluded her statement, Jessica was the first to respond. Her initial reaction was anger, though it was not immediately clear whether that anger was directed primarily at her father for his original deception, at her mother for maintaining silence about it for 30 years, or at the situation generally. Jessica's voice shook as she asked why Patricia had chosen this particular moment and this particular venue to reveal information that had been concealed for decades. She expressed distress that something this significant was being disclosed on a television stage in front of cameras, crew members, and studio audience rather than in a private family conversation where they could process the information without public observation. Patricia acknowledged that her choice of venue was unconventional and potentially unfair to Jessica and Matthew. However, she explained that she had been attempting to find the courage to have this conversation privately for months and had consistently retreated from disclosure. She recognized that using the Family Feud taping as a catalyst for truth-telling was imperfect and possibly cowardly. However, she had reached a point where continuing to maintain silence felt impossible, and she had believed that creating external circumstances that would force the conversation might be her only viable path to finally speaking the truth her children deserved to know. Matthew asked questions that reflected his own process of trying to integrate this new information with his existing understanding of his family history. He wanted to know how substantial the concealed assets had been, why their father had chosen to hide this wealth, and what had been the practical impact on their childhood circumstances. Patricia provided answers as completely as she was able, acknowledging areas where her own knowledge was limited but emphasizing that the concealment had been significant enough that their childhood could have been materially different had James been honest about his resources. Steve Harvey, who had been listening intently to this family confrontation, eventually spoke. His words reflected both compassion for the pain evident in all family members present and a clear moral perspective on the situation being described. He addressed Patricia directly, acknowledging that carrying such a secret for 30 years must have been extraordinarily difficult and that her decision to finally reveal the truth, regardless of the venue, required considerable courage. However, he also gently challenged her regarding her complicity in maintaining James's deception, noting that protecting someone from the consequences of their dishonest behavior is itself a form of dishonesty that can ultimately cause more harm than immediate truth-telling would have caused. Steve then addressed Jessica and Matthew, acknowledging that learning this information about their father and about their mother's silence was undoubtedly painful and disorienting. He emphasized that both Patricia and James had made choices that prioritized considerations other than complete honesty with their children, and that those choices had deprived Jessica and Matthew of the ability to fully understand their own family history. He encouraged them to take whatever time they needed to process this information and to determine how they wanted to respond both to their father's original deception and to their mother's decades of silence about that deception. Steve made a decision that production would halt entirely for the day. He stated clearly that the game show competition was no longer the relevant focus, and that what mattered was providing this family with space to begin addressing the revelations that had just been disclosed. He offered to arrange for the family to have access to private space, where they could continue their conversation away from cameras and studio personnel. He also indicated that the show's producers would connect them with professional family counseling resources if they were interested in receiving such support. The Morrison family accepted Steve Harvey's offer of private space and spent over 2 hours in conversation following the halted taping. The discussion was difficult and emotional, characterized by expressions of hurt, anger, confusion, and attempts at mutual understanding. Jessica struggled to reconcile the father she had known throughout her life with the person described in her mother's revelation. Matthew expressed feeling betrayed by both parents, recognizing that both his father's original deception and his mother's prolonged silence had deprived him of accurate information about his own family history. Patricia apologized repeatedly to both children for her role in maintaining the deception. She acknowledged that her original motivation had been partly practical and partly motivated by fear of conflict. but that her continued silence over subsequent decades had been increasingly difficult to justify. She recognized that protecting Jessica and Matthew from difficult truths about their father had not actually protected them, but had rather deprived them of the ability to make informed decisions about their relationships with him based on complete information. The family did not achieve complete resolution during that extended conversation. The wounds opened by Patricia's revelations were too fresh and the implications too significant for quick processing or easy forgiveness. However, they did establish agreement about several important next steps. Jessica insisted that she needed to have direct conversation with her father about what Patricia had revealed, wanting to hear James's perspective before drawing final conclusions about the situation. Matthew indicated that he needed time and space to process the information before determining how he wanted to proceed with relationships with both parents. Patricia agreed that contacting James was appropriate and necessary, though she acknowledged that she could not predict how he would respond to learning that the secret they had maintained for 3 decades had now been revealed to their children. She accepted responsibility for unilaterally breaking their agreement to maintain silence and recognized that James might respond with anger or with attempts to deny or minimize the significance of his concealment. The Family Feud production team made the decision not to air the episode in its intended format. However, they did work with the Morrison family to create a special segment that addressed family secrets, the cost of prolonged deception, and the challenges of pursuing truth, telling after extended periods of silence. The segment included substantial portions of Patricia's revelation and the family's initial responses, presented with appropriate context and with the family's full consent. The production team also arranged for Patricia, Jessica, and Matthew to have access to family therapy services at no cost, recognizing that professional support would be valuable as they navigated the aftermath of these disclosures. Jessica did eventually contact her father to discuss what she had learned. The conversation was extremely difficult and did not result in James accepting full responsibility for his actions or acknowledging the extent of harm caused by his deception. He maintained that his decision to conceal his inheritance had been motivated by concerns about how sudden wealth might affect his young marriage, and that he had believed he was acting in the family's best interests by managing those resources privately. He argued that Patricia's decision to reveal this information after 30 years of agreed upon silence was vindictive and motivated by desire to damage his relationship with his children. Jessica found her father's explanations inadequate and his refusal to accept meaningful accountability deeply disappointing. The revelation fundamentally altered her perception of James and forced her to reevaluate their entire relationship through the lens of this new information. She reduced contact with her father significantly and postponed her wedding plans indefinitely, recognizing that she needed time to process her family situation before making her own commitment to marriage and potential parenthood. Matthew's response followed a somewhat different trajectory. While equally hurt and angry about the deceptions maintained by both parents, he ultimately concluded that attempting to maintain relationships with both Patricia and James was important to him, despite the pain associated with what he had learned. He established clearer boundaries with his father regarding expectations for honesty and accountability. He also worked with his mother to repair their relationship, though trust damaged by 30 years of concealment required considerable time and effort to rebuild. The special segment that aired several months after the original taping generated substantial public response. Mental health professionals praised Patricia's eventual truth, telling while also noting the significant costs associated with prolonged silence about family secrets. Family therapists used the episode as a teaching tool for discussing how attempts to protect children from difficult truths can ultimately cause more harm than appropriate honesty would have caused. Legal experts discussed the implications of agreements to conceal information during divorce proceedings and the ways that such agreements can perpetuate harm across generations. Many viewers reached out to share their own experiences with family secrets, with discovering that parents had concealed significant information, or with struggling to determine when and how to reveal difficult truths to family members. The response demonstrated that the Morrison family's situation, while specific in its details, reflected broader patterns that many families navigate regarding the tension between protecting loved ones and maintaining honesty about consequential matters. 1 year following the revelation, Patricia reflected on her decision to finally break her silence despite the venue being highly unconventional and the immediate consequences being painful for everyone involved. She acknowledged that choosing to reveal the truth during a Family Feud taping had been imperfect and had created complications that would not have existed had she found the courage to have the conversation privately. However, she maintained that continuing to carry the secret had become unsustainable and that her inability to initiate private disclosure had made some form of external catalyst necessary, even if that catalyst took an unusual form. Patricia's relationship with Jessica required extensive work to repair. The combination of learning about her father's deception and recognizing that her mother had concealed that deception for decades created complex feelings of betrayal that could not be quickly resolved. However, both women committed to the difficult work of rebuilding trust through consistent honesty, regular communication, and willingness to acknowledge the pain that had been caused by prolonged silence. Jessica eventually came to understand that her mother's choices, while flawed, had been motivated by a complicated mixture of practical considerations, fear, and misguided attempts at protection rather than by malice or indifference to her well-being. The relationship between Patricia and James did not recover from the revelation. James maintained that Patricia's decision to break their agreement constituted a fundamental betrayal that ended any possibility of continued cooperation or respect. Patricia accepted this consequence, recognizing that preserving James's goodwill had required her to maintain complicity in deception that had harmed their children. She concluded that her relationship with her former spouse was an acceptable loss if the cost of maintaining that relationship was continued dishonesty with Jessica and Matthew. 5 years after the revelation, the Morrison family had achieved a new equilibrium that looked substantially different from their pre-revelation relationships, but that was characterized by greater authenticity and honesty. Jessica had ultimately married her fiancé and had begun building her own family with conscious commitment to maintaining honest communication, even when that honesty was difficult or uncomfortable. She cited her family's experience as motivation for ensuring that her own children would be raised with age-appropriate truth, telling rather than with protective deceptions that might eventually create larger problems. Matthew maintained limited contact with his father while preserving a closer relationship with his mother, though that relationship continued to be shaped by the recognition that Patricia had concealed significant information for decades. He acknowledged that his mother's eventual truth-telling had been courageous even if it came later than would have been ideal, and he valued the increased honesty that now characterized their interactions. Patricia herself experienced the revelation's aftermath as a combination of relief and ongoing regret. The relief came from no longer carrying a secret that had burdened her for 3 decades, and from having finally provided her children with complete information about their family history. The regret stemmed from recognizing that earlier honesty would have created better outcomes, and that her 30 years of silence had deprived Jessica and Matthew of the ability to make informed decisions about their relationship with their father during their formative years and young adulthood. The broader impact of the Morrison family's story extended beyond their immediate situation. The episode sparked conversations about the ethics of maintaining secrets in families, about the proper balance between protecting children and providing them with honest information, and about the ways that seemingly well-intentioned deceptions can accumulate over time to create larger problems than immediate truth-telling would have caused. Family therapists reported increased inquiries from clients struggling with similar questions about whether to reveal concealed family information and about how to approach such revelations in ways that minimize harm while honoring the importance of truth. 10 years after that November afternoon when Patricia Morrison revealed her 30-year-old secret on the Family Feud stage, the episode remained a significant reference point for discussions about family secrets and the cost of prolonged deception. The story illustrated that while truth telling is generally preferable to concealment. The timing and manner of such truth telling matters significantly, and that revelations delivered in suboptimal circumstances can create additional complications even as they address underlying problems created by the original deception. The Morrison family's experience demonstrated that families can survive revelations of significant deceptions, but that rebuilding trust after extended periods of concealment requires substantial time, effort, and commitment from all parties involved. Patricia's decision to finally break her silence, while imperfect in its execution, had ultimately provided her children with information they deserved to possess and had freed her from the burden of maintaining a secret that had shaped 3 decades of her life in predominantly negative ways. If this narrative has resonated with your own understanding of family complexity and the challenges inherent in navigating tensions between protective silence and honest disclosure, please take a moment to support this channel by selecting the like option and subscribing to receive future content. Consider sharing this story with individuals who might benefit from recognizing that family secrets, while sometimes maintained with good intentions, typically create costs that accumulate over time and ultimately exceed whatever benefits the secrecy was intended to provide. Patricia Morrison's confession during that Family Feud taping, while delivered in an unconventional and imperfect manner, carried an essential message about the importance of truth, telling even when such honesty arrives later than would have been ideal. The courage required to finally speak difficult truths after extended silence, while not negating the harm caused by that silence, represents an important step toward authentic relationships and personal integrity. Family relationships built on complete honesty, even when that honesty involves acknowledging past deceptions and mistakes, ultimately prove more resilient and satisfying than relationships maintained through protective concealment of difficult realities. That lesson, revealed during an unexpected moment on a game show stage, continues to inform conversations about family dynamics and the proper balance between protection and truth more than a decade after the original revelation.